The National Archaeological Museum of Naples is one of the oldest museums in Europe. If you get the chance to visit, you'll encounter an extensive collection of Greek and Roman antiquities, including the illustrious Farnese marbles and the famous Alexander mosaic. If, however, your taste in antiquities leans a bit more towards the provocative, you may be more interested in the artifacts contained in the so-called secret cabinet. This collection, having held various monikers over the years, is comprised of 250 sexually themed artifacts once deemed too scandalous for public consumption. Locked away for the better part of 200 years, these artifacts provide a unique glimpse into the private lives and societal beliefs of our ancient predecessors. But just how did they become shrouded in secrecy, hidden away from prying eyes? For the answer, we have to turn to the advent of modern archaeology and the excavations of the ancient cities at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. In the year 79 CE, the wrath of Mount Vesuvius rained down upon the nearby cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, burying them in meters of ash and pumice. Paradoxically, the ashfall deposits and pyroclastic flow that destroyed these cities preserved their streets, homes, and shops in remarkable detail, providing an unparalleled trove of archaeological evidence for Roman culture and domestic life in the early empire. By and large, these sites were left relatively undisturbed until their rediscovery over 1,000 years later. Excavations in Herculaneum began in 1738, and those in Pompeii followed 10 years later. These excavations unearthed a wealth of truly gorgeous art objects, including sculptures, mosaics, and frescoes that brought the ancient world to life in vivid color like never before. Charles III of Bourbon, eager to transform Naples into a center of the arts, commissioned the construction of a museum to house these discoveries, along with the extensive Farnese collection he inherited from his mother. The museum was intended to display the rich history of the Neapolitan nation, emphasizing its cultural inheritance from classical antiquity. What better way to showcase the glory and prestige of the royal crown? As excavations went on, however, they brought to light an aspect of the ancient world that posed a bit of a problem for this identification with the past. Amongst the grand villas and public baths, excavators discovered what they saw as a culture steeped in obscenity. The Vesuvian cities were filled with sexually explicit imagery that violently clashed with Victorian sensibilities. The sheer number of phallic imagery in erotic art sparked moral outrage and panic among polite society, giving rise to frequent comparisons between Pompeii and the biblical city of Sodom. The revelation of ancient Rome's openness to representations of sexuality threatened not only the prevailing view of antiquity, but also the sense of self that many European nations derived from the belief in an ancestral classical heritage. How could the descendants of a culture that created such explicit artifacts lay claim to any sense of ancient nobility or virtuosity? Some excavators, emboldened by righteous fury, took it upon themselves to destroy the offending art. One artifact, however, stood out among the rest: the infamous Pan and the Goat sculpture. Discovered in 1752 in the peristyle gardens of the Villa of Papyri at Herculaneum, this sculpture depicts the god Pan having sex with a goat, a brazen celebration of the liminal, interrogating the boundaries between beast and man. What was perfectly acceptable garden decor for the Romans was seen as highly offensive to 18th century excavators. Such an explicit depiction of bestiality was deemed highly unsuitable for public consumption, and so the marble group was locked away in a cupboard immediately following its restoration. Over 2 centuries later, John Paul Getty conspicuously omitted the statue from his recreation of the Villa of the Papyri Gardens, a reminder of the enduring legacy of Bourbon censorship. Similar fates befell countless other artifacts unearthed in the Vesuvian excavations. In 1819, Francis I, Duke of Calabria and future King of Naples, visited the museum with his wife and children. When family outing took a scandalizing turn, the morally affronted Duke mentioned to Michel Arditi, the museum's curator at the time, that it would be a good idea to shut away all the obscene objects in a single room and to only admit mature persons whose impeccable morals were well known. And thus was born the fortress of virtue first known as the Gabinetto dei Oggetti Osceni, or the Cabinet of Obscene Objects. It originally contained 102 potentially offensive artifacts. If the decline of the Roman Empire stemmed from some internal depravity, as was commonly believed at the time, then surely keeping the products of pagan licentiousness under lock and key was the only way to protect modern society from meeting a similar end. In his seminal work, The Secret Museum, Walter Kendrick identifies this censorship of erotic antiquities as the origin of modern pornography. Evidence for this argument comes from the first mainstream definition of pornography from the 1864 edition of Webster's Dictionary. It defines pornography as licentious painting or literature, especially the painting anciently employed to decorate the walls of rooms devoted to bacchanalian orgies. This definition illustrates the substantial gap between ancient Roman and Victorian constructions of sexuality. Early excavators originally reasoned that the presence of any erotic art in a space indicated that it must have been used as a brothel. These paintings would have elicited much different responses from the Roman audience. The Roman poet Ovid, for instance, speaks to the suitability of sexually themed artwork in one's house. Surely, just like the painted figures of ancient heroes decorate our houses, there are little paintings in some places, depicting various forms and acts of love. Just as there's Telamone and Ajax, skulking in rage, or savage Medea with murder in her eyes, so too is there Venus, wringing her dripping hair through her fingers, barely covered by the waters that bore her. These works of art were signs of luxury and sophistication, often intended to indicate the erudition of the homeowner through the inclusion of scenes from literature and myth. Of all the materials dealing with erotic subjects to have come down to us from the Vesuvian towns, the largest group is paintings of mythological scenes, such as Leda and the Swan, or Polyphemus in Galatea. It was particularly fashionable to have such paintings as the set pieces in the center of the walls of one's triclinium, or dining room, where they could easily be shown off to guests. Sex was an essential part of the idea of luxuria that went hand in hand with Roman dinner parties. Stepping outside to the bustling streets of Pompeii and Herculaneum, one would be confronted with an abundance of phallic imagery. The phallus was regarded as a talisman of fertility and prosperity, believed to be able to ward off the malevolent glance of the evil eye. For this reason, phallic representations were popular decor in both public and private spaces. People even wore amulets with phallic imagery, sort of like a type of good luck charm. We also have a large number of surviving tintinnabula, or wind chimes, decorated in a similar vein. The sound they made while dancing through the wind was thought to bring about abundance and prosperity. One famous tintinnabulum on display in the secret cabinet depicts a gladiator, armed with a sword engaged in fierce combat with a wild beast, which just so happens to be his own phallus, perhaps commenting on the intersection of danger and desire. It was typical to find sexual imagery on household objects as well, including oil lamps and tableware. For the Romans, sex and nudity were a part of everyday life, far from the subjects of moral outrage. The creation of the secret cabinet obscured this aspect of Roman life and separated the offending objects from both their cultural and archaeological context. Anyone who wished to visit the collection needed the express permission of the Minister of the Interior, and foreign visitors were required to obtain written permission from their ambassador. These restrictions ensured that the contents of the secret cabinet were only accessible to wealthy men with political connections, leaving women in the working class out in the cold. But you see, censorship has a funny way of stoking desire. It's all part of what Michel Foucault referred to as the process of transforming sex into discourse. By regulating access to the secret cabinet, those in power effectively transformed ancient sexuality into a commodity, creating an exclusive market for the consumption of erotic antiquities. Scarcity of access made the proverbial forbidden fruit all the more tantalizing, ripe for the taking, but only to those with the right connections. In effect, the secret cabinet was one of the worst kept secrets in Europe. Within 2 years, requests for access skyrocketed from 20 to over 300. The fascination surrounding the secret cabinet gave rise to an elite class of gentlemen connoisseurs and collectors, hungry for the cultural capital of erotic antiquities. Access to restricted collections like the secret cabinet became a sort of status symbol, reinforcing hierarchies based on gender and class. The use of censorship as a form of social power is evident in a number of guidebooks and catalogs of the collection published during the 19th century. Barré's 8-volume compilation of the works of the museum contains one of the most comprehensive guides to the collection. The engravings were visually censored, reducing the scale of the genitals or omitting them entirely. And, if that wasn't enough, Barré included an additional safeguard within the text itself. Latin and Greek texts were left untranslated, ensuring that only those who could afford a classical education could fully access the work. In the preface, Barré himself justifies this decision, stating, "We have taken all the prudential measures applicable to such a collection of engraving and text. We have endeavored to make its reading inaccessible, so to speak, to poorly educated persons, as well as those whose sex and age forbid any exception to the laws of decency and modesty." Funny how those who are exempt from the laws of decency and modesty are the ones who make the rules, and who get to decide where to draw the line between art and obscenity. Restrictions surrounding the secret cabinet fluctuated over the years, reflecting the changing political climate. In 1860, revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi claimed the museum as national property and demanded the cabinet be open to the public, even if it meant knocking down the doors. The pendulum swung back at the beginning of the 20th century, and restrictions were reinstated, limiting access to scholars and artists. Amedeo Maiuri, the archaeologist in charge of the museum and excavations during the fascist era, tried to put an end to visits altogether. He even attempted to conceal erotic paintings on site at Pompeii and Herculaneum by installing hinged wooden covers over them. In 2000, the museum officially opened the secret cabinet as a permanent exhibit, much to the excitement of the international press. To access the collection, you have to pass through an imposing set of iron gates, a stark reminder that you're entering a once forbidden space. The atmosphere inside is meticulously designed to transport you back to the early 19th century. It's like you're stepping into the parlor of some Victorian gentleman connoisseur with a rather specific taste in art. The museum's literature projects a modern and progressive view of erotic antiquities, but the exhibit itself keeps drawing you back into the setting of centuries past. Its faux historical aesthetic invites you to interpret the artifacts on display through the lens of their historical reception and censorship, rather than their original Roman context. Signage in both English and Italian is available to help visitors interpret the exhibit, but it's far from visually salient. A 2011 study revealed that only 5% of tourists even read the information available. Education on the social and cultural roles of sexuality in ancient Rome may be one of the stated goals of the exhibit, but it's far from its main selling point. Most of the artifacts in the secret cabinet are accessible now more than ever, but the museum is still capitalizing on the allure of a historical peep show. The items on display are largely decontextualized from their original historical setting, grouped together solely based on modern notions of sexuality and obscenity, and kept separate from the rest of the museum. Take, for instance, the satyr and nymph mosaic from the House of the Faun at Pompeii. The museum has a whole section dedicated to artifacts from this villa, but this mosaic is housed instead in the secret cabinet because it's deemed erotic. Now, if the goal is to showcase the differences in ancient Roman attitudes towards sexuality, wouldn't it make more sense to include sexually themed everyday objects within the Everyday Object collection? The British Museum used to have its own restricted collection of erotic antiquities, known as the Secretum. It was created to house the personal collection of over 400 phallocentric objects donated to the museum by antiquarian George Witt in 1865. The collection even included a terracotta copy of the Pan and the Goat sculpture. Over time, the secretum was broken up, and the artifacts were redistributed among other collections based on their time period and culture of origin. If the concern is shielding young eyes from inappropriate content, shouldn't the Farnese Hercules be subject to the same censorship as the Venus in a bikini? I mean, come on, that's a sexy statue. They say sex sells, but in the case of the secret cabinet, is it really sex, or the thrill of getting to peek behind the curtain, the same allure of the forbidden that drove Victorian censorship? Ultimately, the modern exhibit may tell us more about ourselves and our own society than the Romans. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into classical history and reception. Thanks for watching.